When a crime lord grips a stranger's arm at his own dinner table, the table has already become a coffin. Ryan Kwan had never needed to grip anyone. For 20 years, a single glance had been enough to end arguments, careers, and lives. Until the night a girl in a red dress reached across the table and stopped his hand, and the entire syndicate watched him let her. That single act rewrote the balance of power across 3 criminal territories. Because in a world where dominance is the only currency, the most lethal thing isn't a weapon. It's the one person the most dangerous man in the room cannot predict. Mira Solon was about to discover that surviving inside the syndicate doesn't mean staying quiet and staying small. It means learning, very quickly, that the difference between a hostage and a queen is nothing more than nerve. Stay until the end, hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments. I want to know how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. Before we go any further, if you're not subscribed yet, I need you to stop and think about that. Because someone sent you this video. Or the algorithm found you. And that almost never happens by accident. You were meant to hear this story. But if you leave without subscribing, the next story, the one that might genuinely change something in you, will never find you. And you won't even know what you missed. That's the cruelest kind of loss. Hit subscribe. Turn on the bell. And drop your city in the comments right now. Let's see how far this story travels. Okay. Now, let's really begin. The chandeliers in the Kwan Estate's private dining hall had been imported from a decommissioned French palace. Mira knew this because the invitation, the one she now deeply regretted accepting, had described the venue in the kind of breathless detail that people use when they want you to feel honored before they use you. She was not honored. She was calculating the fastest route to the nearest exit and pretending to admire the centerpiece. The table seated 24. It was set for 12. Crystal stemware that caught the candlelight like something precious and breakable. White linen so starched it looked surgical. 3 courses already plated and waiting, each one arranged with the kind of aggressive perfection that said someone here has something to prove. She was not supposed to be here at all. Her colleague Dr. Ren had fallen ill that morning and passed along the seat with the careless generosity of someone who didn't know what kind of dinner this actually was. It's a private charity event, Ren had said, already halfway back to bed. Old money, lots of wine, boring speeches. You'll be home by 10. Mira had looked up the address. She had not been home by 10. The people filling these seats did not move like guests at a charity event. They moved like people who owned the concept of charity itself. Women draped in jewelry that could fund small governments. Men whose suits sat on their shoulders with the particular stillness of something sheathed. Conversations were conducted in murmurs, and every murmur had the texture of a negotiation. Mira had worked in financial compliance long enough to recognize the difference between wealth that built things and wealth that consumed them. Every person in this room was the second kind. She had taken the seat Dr. Ren had assigned her, third from the head of the table, to the left, and spent the first 40 minutes performing the expression of someone who belonged. She was good at this. She had grown up in rooms where she wasn't supposed to ask questions and had learned early that the safest version of invisible was pleasantly, forgettably present. She had almost convinced herself she would make it through the evening. Then the man to her right leaned in. He was mid-50s, the specific variety of powerful that had stopped needing to exercise charm years ago. His smile arrived like a verdict. "You seem a little out of place," he said, his eyes traveling from her face to her collar to the modest cut of her dress with the slow assessment of someone pricing an item. "Guest of someone's, or a colleague's," Mira said, keeping her tone politely neutral. She wasn't able to attend. He reached past her for the wine without asking. Generous of her. Seats at this table aren't easy to come by. He paused, letting that settle. For most people. Nira understood the implication perfectly. She smiled through it. Must be quite the occasion, she offered, deflecting. Oh, it is. He lowered his voice with the confidence of someone who assumed proximity was always welcome. You know whose house this is? I do now, she said carefully. Then you know the smart move tonight is to make yourself useful. His smile widened. A woman with your kind of observational instincts, I can see you watching everything, could do very well at a table like this. If she understood the room. Nira set down her water glass. She had a response forming, measured, professional, the kind that shut doors without slamming them, when the man's sentence simply stopped. Not because she said anything. Because the room temperature dropped. The man at the head of the table had turned. Nira had been careful, all evening, not to look directly at him. The way you are careful not to look directly at a wound that might be worse than you can handle. But now every instinct she possessed pointed her toward the same place the rest of the room was already pointed. Ryan Kwan. She'd seen photographs. Photographs did not prepare you. He was built like someone who had survived things that should have finished him and came out the other side with the kind of stillness that was more unsettling than motion. The scar that ran along the left side of his jaw caught the candlelight in a way that made it look carved rather than healed. His suit was dark, understated, and managed to be the most expensive thing in the room without trying. He wore a single piece of ornamentation, a small gold dragon pin at his lapel, no larger than a thumbnail, which somehow carried the weight of a flag. His eyes were on her neighbor. I believe, Ryan said, his voice low enough that only their end of the table heard it, that the lady is not interested. It was not a reprimand. It was not even a warning, exactly. It was the announcement of a fact, delivered with the calm certainty of someone reading the weather. The man beside her went very still. Of course, he said. My apologies. I was only. You were leaving, Ryan said. To check on the donation you promised the foundation 6 months ago. Weren't you? It was not a question either. The man stood so quickly his chair scraped, mumbled something that collapsed before it became a sentence, and relocated himself to the opposite end of the table with impressive speed for someone his age. Nira exhaled slowly through her nose. Thank you, she said, because silence felt worse. Though I was managing. I know. Ryan's gaze moved to her for the first time directly, and Nira felt the specific discomfort of being seen by someone who didn't miss much. You've been managing since the moment you sat down. You've also been watching every exit and every face at this table and trying very hard to look like you aren't. Nira said nothing. You're not one of them, he said. It wasn't an insult. It was an observation. No, she agreed. Then why are you here? Wrong place. She paused. Possibly wrong evening. Something shifted fractionally at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, more like the ghost of one, remembered from a long time ago. Nira Solon, she offered, before she could think better of it. I know, he said again. That stopped her. You know. I asked who was sitting in Dr. Ren's seat when she cancelled. His tone was matter-of-fact. Financial compliance. Independent. Thorough. The kind of person who notices things. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't place. The kind of person who, for example, might notice that the dish placed in front of me approximately 4 minutes ago was prepared by someone who isn't Chef Han. Nira's eyes dropped to his plate before she could stop herself. The garnish was wrong. A small thing. The kind of small thing that meant nothing, unless you knew that the original preparation had been confirmed 3 hours ago, that Chef Han had initialed every plate personally, and that the substitute garnish was the kind used to mask certain bitter compounds when you needed a dish to still smell correct. Her stomach turned over very quietly. She looked up. He was already watching her. "You see it," he said. It was not a question. Her hand moved before her logic caught up with it, reaching across, 2 inches of contact between her fingertips and his wrist, stopping him before the fork completed its arc toward his mouth. The room went silent. Not gradually. Instantly. As though someone had cut the sound with a knife. 24 suited figures became statues. She felt, rather than saw, the shift in every body in the room, the collective inhale, the hands that moved toward jacket lapels and then stopped, waiting. Voss Giro, standing 3 feet behind Ryan's chair, went so still he stopped looking human. Ryan looked down at her hand on his wrist. He looked up at her face. Then, slowly, with the deliberate unhurried certainty of a man who had not been surprised in a very long time, he set down the fork. His hand turned, and closed around her arm. Not violently. Not gently either. The grip of someone establishing a fact. "Dine with me," he said, "before I lose my patience." The words were quiet. They didn't need to be loud. The room had already understood. Neera's pulse was a living, physical thing inside her ears. Every reasonable thought she had said the same thing: sit down, say nothing, let the professionals handle this, you are not equipped for whatever comes next. But Ryan Kwan's eyes were still on hers, and inside them, beneath the iron and the cold and the weight of 20 years of things she would never fully understand, she saw something she hadn't expected. He was asking. Neera pulled her chair back in. The evening had, as it turned out, only just begun. Dr. Ren owed her an apology. Possibly in writing. The car that had been sent to collect her, sent, not hired, there was a difference she understood only after it arrived, had no visible company markings, no meter, and a driver who responded to every attempt at conversation with the kind of professional silence that suggested he had signed something legally binding about it. The route had taken her away from the city's familiar grid and into the kind of neighborhood that didn't appear on food delivery maps. Old money architecture. High walls. Trees so manicured they looked like they'd been individually briefed. The entry hall alone was larger than her entire apartment, and it smelled the way she imagined power smelled if power were a place: expensive wood, fresh flowers that cost more than her grocery bill, and underneath it all, something colder. Something that had nothing to do with the temperature. The other guests were already gathered in a reception room off the main corridor, holding crystal glasses and performing the social rituals of people who did not need to be charmed by anything because they already owned it. Neera accepted a glass from a passing server she didn't ask for and held it the way you hold something when you need your hands to look occupied. She watched. This was, she had long ago accepted, her primary talent. Not brilliance exactly, more the specific sharpness that develops when you spend years in rooms where the official version of events and the real version of events are never quite the same thing. In financial compliance you learn to read what wasn't written. You learned that the most important number on any document was usually the one nobody mentioned. Here, the numbers were people. She counted 3 men who arrived with other men positioned slightly behind them, not colleagues, not equals, but shadows that moved when they moved. She counted 2 conversations that stopped completely when she walked past, then resumed at a different register. She counted the security she could see and estimated, conservatively, that it was half of what was actually present. She recounted the exits. The people in this room did not look bored. They looked like the kind of focus that gets mistaken for relaxed until something goes wrong. They moved with the ease of people who had made every consequential decision in the building before any guest arrived. The charity, Neera had already concluded, was the least important thing happening tonight. She drifted toward the edge of the room in the way she'd perfected over years of being the youngest person in difficult spaces, visible enough not to seem like she was hiding, unremarkable enough not to invite attention. Her eyes moved to the double doors at the far end of the room. Closed. Dark wood. A single guard positioned to the left who was doing an excellent impression of furniture. Behind those doors was the dining room. Behind those doors was whoever everyone in this room was quietly, carefully, and very deliberately not talking about. Mira took a sip of wine she didn't taste. She already knew she was going to walk through those doors. She just hadn't decided yet whether that made her brave or catastrophically stupid. It was the parsley that saved his life. Not the kind of detail that announces itself. Not a warning written in the architecture of the room or a whispered word from a well-placed source. Just a sprig of flat-leaf parsley, positioned at the 9 o'clock edge of a hand-painted ceramic plate, slightly crushed on the left side where a thumb had pressed it into place in a hurry. Mira noticed it the way she noticed most things, sideways, while appearing to be looking at something else entirely. She had been watching the servers. Old habit. In any room where the official story was the only story being told, the people tasked with moving silently through it always knew more than anyone gave them credit for. She'd catalogued 3 of them already, their routes, their rhythms, the practiced invisibility of people who had done this many times before in this specific room for this specific man. The 4th server she didn't recognize. That alone meant nothing. Staff rotated. People called in sick. But this one moved differently, not wrong exactly, just slightly too deliberate, the way someone moves when they've rehearsed a route rather than learned it. He kept his eyes down at the precise angle of someone who had been told to keep his eyes down rather than someone who simply did. Mira tracked him without turning her head. He came from the kitchen corridor, not the staging area where the other servers had been collecting plates. He carried a single dish, Ryan's, she noted, already placed at the head of the table before the others had been distributed. He set it down with both hands and adjusted the garnish once, unnecessarily, before stepping back. The garnish. The parsley had been upright when Mira had seen the original plates staged near the kitchen entrance 20 minutes ago. She had noticed because the presentation had been precise to the point of obsessive, every element placed with ruler accuracy. Chef Han, who had been visible in the corridor twice during the evening, ran her kitchen the way serious people ran things, without variation and without tolerance for it. The parsley on Ryan's plate was crushed. Placed in a hurry. By someone who knew what they were hiding underneath it. The recognition moved through Mira not as panic but as cold, clarifying certainty, the same sensation she got the moment a spreadsheet revealed what someone had hoped it wouldn't. The garnish was covering something. The substitute server had come from the wrong direction. And Ryan Kwan, who had survived 20 years in an industry that killed people for enjoying it too much, was reaching for his fork. Her hand moved. The contact lasted less than 2 seconds, her fingertips against his wrist, enough pressure to interrupt the motion, nothing more. But in that room, in that silence, it was the loudest thing she had ever done in her life. The fork stopped. Every person behind them stopped with it. Ryan looked down at her hand. Then up at her face. His expression did not change. That was almost worse than if it had. He set the fork down. Then his hand turned, and closed around her arm just below the elbow, not a gesture, not a question, and the world she had been living in until 48 hours ago quietly ceased to be available to her. "Dine with me," he said, "before I lose my patience." Mira did not move. Did not breathe. 12 suited men stood behind them like a wall that had learned to dress well, and not one of them intervened, because not one of them had been told to. Voss Giro, stationed at Ryan's right, had his eyes fixed on her face with the focused neutrality of someone running rapid calculations about whether she was a threat or an asset and not yet having reached a conclusion. She thought about the exit she'd clocked behind the east-facing service door. She thought about Dr. Wren, who genuinely owed her a written apology now. She sat down. They did not tell her she was a prisoner. That was the part she kept returning to, in the hours after the dining room emptied and the suited men dispersed and she was shown, not escorted, shown, there was a difference that felt important, to a guest suite on the estate's third floor. No one used words like detained or held. No one needed to. The suite had fresh flowers, a bathroom with Italian marble, a view of manicured grounds that looked beautiful and unscalable in equal measure, and a door that locked from the outside with the soft, expensive click of something that had been designed to sound like courtesy. Mira sat on the edge of the bed and conducted a thorough inventory of her situation. Her phone had signal. That was either reassuring or deliberate, and she hadn't yet decided which. She typed a message to her building supervisor about her mail, kept it casual, sent it. Then she sat very still and thought about the fact that she had just sent a message to her building supervisor about her mail, because something in her understood that drawing a larger map of her absence was not, at this particular moment, a safe creative choice. She was still thinking about this when the knock came. Boss Jiro did not enter without being invited. He stood in the doorway with the stillness of someone who had learned patience as a professional discipline rather than a personality trait, and he looked at her with eyes that were neither warm nor cold, simply watchful, the way a well-calibrated instrument is watchful. He was younger than she'd expected up close. Late 30s, perhaps. The kind of build that suggested the gym was a workplace rather than a hobby. He set a tray on the side table, tea, she noticed, not wine, which told her someone had paid attention to what she'd left untouched at dinner, and moved back to his original position without invitation. "You should sleep," he said. "I should go home," Mira replied. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. Not disagreement exactly. More the particular stillness of someone who has decided not to correct a misunderstanding out loud because the misunderstanding will resolve itself shortly. "Mr. Kwon will want to speak with you in the morning," he said instead. "And if I'd prefer to speak with him now? He's handling the matter from dinner." A pause, brief and precise. "Which you assisted with. He hasn't forgotten that." Mira looked at him steadily. "Is that a reassurance?" "It's context," Boss said. She stood and walked to the window. The grounds below were lit at intervals, soft landscape lighting that served a second purpose she didn't need explained to her. Two figures moved along the far perimeter in a pattern that was not a patrol only in the technical sense that no one had called it one. "How many people have stayed in this room?" she asked, not really expecting an answer, and then simply left in the morning. Voss didn't answer immediately. That, she was learning, was its own kind of answer. "Get some sleep, Miss Solon," he said finally. "Tomorrow is a long day." He pulled the door closed behind him with that same soft, expensive click. Mira stood at the window for a long time, watching the men below trace their quiet, endless circuit through the dark, and understood, with the specific clarity of someone who had spent years reading what wasn't written, that the gilded part of a cage was never the point. The cage was always the point. She met Jalen Seo the way you meet most dangerous things, accidentally, while looking at something else. Morning had arrived at the estate with the kind of composed, indifferent beauty that expensive places always managed regardless of what happened inside them. Mira had slept badly and woken early, and when no one appeared to stop her from moving through the east corridor toward what turned out to be a sunlit breakfast room, she had made the reasonable calculation that limited freedom was still a form of information. She was studying the grounds through the tall windows, cataloging what daylight revealed that darkness had obscured, when she heard them. The voices came from the adjacent room, a study or a library, door not fully closed. She recognized Ryan's first. Low, unhurried, the tone of a man accustomed to saying things once. The second voice was different. Precise in a way that felt constructed. Every word placed with the careful deliberateness of someone who had decided, long ago, that emotion was a liability and had restructured accordingly. She didn't move closer. She didn't need to. The situation was contained, the second voice said. The situation was created, Ryan replied. Those aren't the same thing. A pause. The kitchen staff has been replaced. Han is. I know what Han is. I'm asking how it reached the kitchen at all. Another pause. Longer. The kind that isn't silence so much as calculation wearing silence as a coat. I'm looking into it. You've been looking into a great many things lately, Jalen. The door to the breakfast room opened from the opposite side before the conversation could continue, and Neera turned to find a woman she didn't recognize helping herself to coffee with the ease of someone who had done it in this room before. She was perhaps 40, fine-boned and self-contained, dressed with the deliberate understatement of someone who understood that real authority never announced itself. She looked at Neera the way a chess player looks at an unfamiliar opening, not with hostility, but with the focused attention of someone revising their model of the board. You're the one from dinner, she said. Not unkindly. Neera Solon. Inara Breck. She poured a second cup without asking and set it in front of Neera with the quiet efficiency of someone buying 60 seconds of trust. How are you finding the estate? Comfortable, Neera said carefully. Instructive. Inara's mouth curved slightly. Good answer. She sat, wrapping both hands around her cup, and studied Neera with an openness that felt more deliberate than casual. You noticed something last night that his own people missed. That makes you either very useful or very inconvenient, depending on who's doing the accounting. Neera said nothing. The man you heard just now, Inara continued, her voice dropping without becoming a whisper, has been doing the accounting for 11 years. He is extraordinarily good at it. She looked into her cup briefly. He is also extraordinarily good at deciding, quietly and without announcement, when a variable has become a liability. She stood, smoothed her jacket, and picked up her coffee. I'd suggest, she said, moving toward the door with the unhurried calm of someone who had already said precisely what she intended to say, that you become useful faster than you become inconvenient. She left without looking back. From the adjacent room, the voices had gone silent. Neera sat alone with her coffee and the specific, settling weight of understanding that the most dangerous person in a room full of dangerous people was almost never the one holding the weapon. It was the one keeping score. The message arrived inside a book. Not metaphorically. An actual book, a slim, cloth-bound volume of Korean poetry that appeared on the window seat of her suite sometime between breakfast and the late morning, placed with the casual precision of something that had always been there and was only now being noticed. Neera stared at it for a full minute before touching it. Then she picked it up, turned it over, found no inscription on the cover, and opened it to the page marked by a single folded card. The card had no letterhead. 8 words in clean, unornamented type. The garden. East Gate. Noon. Come alone. CV. Neera read it twice. Then she folded it, placed it back inside the book, and set the book exactly where she'd found it while she thought about what kind of person slips correspondence into a guarded estate as a demonstration rather than a necessity. The answer, she concluded, was the kind who wanted you to understand the demonstration. She went to the garden. Corin Vale was younger than she'd expected, which was its own kind of warning. Mid-40s, lean, with the cultivated ease of someone who had decided early that charm was a more efficient weapon than force and had spent decades sharpening it. He was standing near the East Gate's stone arch when she arrived, not checking his watch, not scanning the grounds, just present, as though waiting cost him nothing, which meant waiting was something he'd chosen rather than accepted. He smiled when he saw her. It reached his eyes, which made it worse. Miss Solon. He said her name like he'd been saying it for years. I appreciate you coming. You didn't give me much of a choice. I gave you exactly a choice, he said pleasantly. That's rather the point. He fell into step beside her along the path without asking, which told her the walk had also been decided in advance. You're an intelligent woman in an unintelligent situation. I find that genuinely unfortunate. How considerate. It is, actually. His tone remained light, which was more unsettling than if it hadn't. You don't belong here. You know that. Ryan knows that. The only question is whether knowing it gets you home or gets you buried, and that depends almost entirely on how the next few weeks unfold. Neera kept her pace even. And you're offering to influence how they unfold. I'm offering you a door, he said. A clean one. No conditions attached to your life afterward, no debts, no surveillance. You go back to your apartment, your job, your very sensible existence, and none of this follows you. He paused at the path's curve, turning to face her with the patient openness of someone presenting a reasonable proposal. In exchange for a conversation. Nothing operational. Nothing that puts anyone in immediate danger. Simply, the shape of things. How decisions get made. Where the weight sits. Ryan's patterns. His vulnerabilities, Neera said. Vale's smile didn't waver. His humanity, he offered gently. Every man has it. I just need to understand his. She looked at him for a long moment. And if I decline? He studied her with something that might, in different lighting, have resembled regret. Then you remain a variable in someone else's equation, he said, with no guarantee of how it resolves. He produced a second card, just a number, nothing else, and held it out between two fingers. Take the night. Think carefully. Neera took the card. She thought about Inara Breck's voice that morning, measured and precise. Become useful faster than you become inconvenient. She thought about Jalen Seo's silence in the study, the kind that kept score. She thought about a folded card inside a book that had appeared inside a guarded estate to remind her that Ryan Kwan's walls kept things in just as efficiently as they kept things out. She closed her fingers around the card and walked back toward the house without answering. Behind her, Corin Vale did not call after her. He didn't need to. The card was already in her hand. She burned the card at 2 a.m. using a candle from the suite's decorative arrangement and watched the number dissolve into a curl of black before she let it go. It was not a decision made in heat. It was a decision made in the particular cold clarity that arrives after every other option has been examined and found to cost more than it appeared. Neera had spent the hours between Vale's garden and the candle doing what she did best, laying the variables out in sequence, assigning weight, tracing consequence forward. She had done it with financial instruments for 6 years. The underlying logic, she had discovered, was identical. Everything was a position. Every position had exposure. The question was never whether risk existed. It was whether you were the one holding it or the one who had quietly transferred it to someone else. Corin Vale had offered her a door. What he had actually offered her was a leash with good branding. She went to Voss Giro before dawn. He was in the ground floor corridor outside the security room, which told her either his hours were inhuman or he'd been expecting movement from her suite. She had stopped trying to determine which. She held out the small residue of burned card, not enough to read, enough to be legible as a decision, and told him, concisely and without editorializing, everything that had happened in the garden. Voss looked at the ash. Then at her face. His expression did not change, but something behind it did, a small, almost imperceptible recalibration, the kind that happens when an estimate is revised upward. All of it, he said. All of it, she confirmed. He took the ash. Wait here. She waited 14 minutes. When he returned, he said only, he'll see you now. Ryan was in the study, standing rather than seated, which she was learning was how he occupied a room when something required his full attention. He listened to her repeat it, Vale's words, the card, the garden, the offer, without interrupting, without expression, with the focused stillness of someone constructing something internally while the materials were still being delivered. When she finished, the silence lasted long enough to have texture. "You could have taken it," he said finally. "I could have," she agreed. "Why didn't you?" She considered giving him something reassuring. Something that sounded like loyalty or conscience, the kind of answer that closed the distance between two people efficiently. Instead she gave him the true one. "Because his door had a ceiling I could already see. Yours doesn't." Ryan looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read, not warmth exactly, but the particular attention of someone encountering a variable they hadn't adequately modeled. "I want you to answer him," he said. "Tell him you're considering. Ask for 3 days. And what do I give him that looks real enough to hold?" "I'll tell you what to give him." He moved to the desk. "Everything he receives will be true enough to be believed and positioned exactly where I need it." Neera understood immediately. Not just bait. Architecture. Vale wouldn't be receiving false information so much as a map with the dangerous rooms deliberately lit. "He'll test it," she said. "I know." Ryan looked up. "So will I." The statement landed without elaboration, which was precisely how it was intended. She was not being threatened. She was being told, with complete honesty, the terms of the arrangement, that her position in it depended on the same thing it always had. What she noticed. And what she chose to do with it. "Understood," Neera said. She meant it. "If you're still here, and you are, then you're my people. You're the ones who aren't afraid to feel. Who don't skip ahead to see what happens. Who understand that the journey matters just as much as the destination." Neera just walked through fire and chose the harder door, and something tells me you understood exactly why she did it. This isn't just a channel. It's a community of people who believe that stories have power. That emotions aren't weakness. That feeling deeply doesn't make you soft, it makes you human. Subscribe right now and join us. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story. And please, drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what you're feeling in this moment. Because the most important thing I want you to know right now is that you are not alone in this. We're all here, watching together. Now. Let's finish this. It happened on a Wednesday, which felt wrong for the kind of conversation it turned out to be. 3 days had passed since the study. The double game was in motion. Vale had received his first carefully architected fragment and responded with the particular enthusiasm of someone who believed he was pulling a thread when he was, in fact, being handed one. Jalen's CO had been quieter than usual, which Inara had told her, in passing, meant he was thinking harder than usual, which was the version of that sentence that should concern her. The estate had settled into a rhythm that Neera had not consented to and had somehow adopted anyway, the way you adopt the grammar of a place simply by living inside it long enough. She had taken to sitting in the East Library in the evenings. No particular reason she would have admitted to. The books were good, the light was better, and it was the one room in the estate where no one appeared to have a scheduled reason to be. Ryan found her there at 9:30. He didn't explain his presence and she didn't ask for an explanation, which was itself a kind of syntax they had developed, the shared understanding that accounting for every movement was a performance neither of them needed from the other. He poured 2 glasses from the decanter on the side table, set one near her without comment, and stood at the window in the way he sometimes stood in rooms, like a man who had never fully learned how to be still without also being watchful. She was the one who asked. She hadn't planned to. But the candlelight caught the scar along his jaw at an angle that made it look less like damage and more like something that had required a decision, and the question arrived before her better judgment could intercept it. "The scar," she said simply. The silence that followed was long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he turned from the window and looked at her with the expression of someone deciding, in real time, whether a door they have kept closed for a specific reason still needs to remain so. I was 23, he said. My father had just died. The men who decided they could move on his territory the week of his funeral did it because they believed grief made you slow. He touched the jaw briefly, not self-consciously, more the way you touch a compass point. They weren't wrong about the grief. They were wrong about what it does to certain people. It made you faster, Mira said. It made me understand, he said, that the only thing more dangerous than a man with power is a man with nothing left to lose who decides, very deliberately, to rebuild. He picked up his glass. The scar was a message I left for anyone who needed reminding of that. Mira absorbed this in the particular way she absorbed things that were true, not immediately, but fully, turning it until she understood not just the surface but the weight underneath it. You've been rebuilding ever since, she said. He looked at her with something that had moved past assessment into a territory she didn't have clean language for. Recognition, perhaps. The specific kind that arrives not when someone understands what you've done, but when they understand why. Everyone in my world wants something from the Empire, he said quietly. Territory. Leverage. Access. He paused. No one has ever simply seen it. The fire settled in the grate. Outside, the perimeter lights traced their patient circuit through the dark. Mira thought about compliance reports and spreadsheets and the particular loneliness of being the person in every room who noticed what everyone else had agreed not to see, and understood, without either of them saying it, that she was sitting across from the only other person she had ever met who lived inside that same particular silence. She didn't say any of this. She didn't need to. He refilled her glass without asking, and they sat together in the quiet library while the estate moved around them, and something that had no clean name settled between them like a foundation being laid in the dark, unhurried, unannounced, and already, without either of them deciding it, load-bearing. She knew 3 hours before it happened. Not because of intelligence passed through proper channels. Not because Vale had been careless. Because she had been feeding him architecture for 11 days and she understood, by now, the shape of how he thought, the way a careful reader understands a writer's rhythm well enough to anticipate the next sentence before it arrives. The fragment she delivered 4 days ago had contained one specific detail, designed by Ryan, positioned like an unlocked door in an otherwise secured corridor. A banquet. Neutral ground by syndicate convention. 12 families, a rotating venue, the kind of gathering that derived its safety entirely from mutual observance of rules everyone understood and no one trusted. The detail she'd given Vale was the security rotation gap, a 4-minute window on the east entrance, real enough to be verified, specific enough to be irresistible. At 6 p.m., 2 hours before the banquet began, she watched Vale's man walk the east corridor twice from a window she wasn't supposed to be near, and understood that the door had been found. She went to Ryan immediately. He was already moving. The thing she hadn't been prepared for, the thing no amount of careful observation had fully equipped her for, was the velocity of it. The estate transformed in under 20 minutes from a place of composed, expensive stillness into something that moved with the concentrated efficiency of a single organism that had rehearsed this exact sequence and was now simply executing it. Voss had men repositioned before she'd finished her second sentence. Ryan had made 3 calls, each under 40 seconds, and she understood from the responses, not the words, the register, that what was being coordinated extended well beyond this building. The east entrance is the diversion, she told Ryan, because she needed him to hear the part that mattered most. He'll expect you to reinforce it. The actual entry point is the service access off the north kitchen corridor. It's the only approach not mentioned in anything I gave him, which means it's the one he found himself. Ryan looked at her. That's where he'll feel safe, she said. Voss was already on his radio. The banquet hall, when the strike came, had already been quietly, invisibly restructured around its own vulnerability. Guests who mattered had been repositioned. The north kitchen corridor, which Vale's men entered at 8:47 with the confidence of people who had done their own reconnaissance, opened instead into a contained space with no secondary exit and a welcome party that had been waiting in the dark for 11 minutes. It was not a long fight. Decisive things rarely are. Neera spent it in the anteroom off the main hall with two of Voss's men flanking her, listening to the specific sounds of something being resolved and tracking, on the notepad she'd requested 40 minutes prior, the sequence of events as she'd anticipated them against the sequence as they unfolded, adjusting, identifying the delta, noting what Vale had adapted at the last moment and where that adaptation had come from. When Voss appeared in the doorway, unhurt, expression carrying the particular flatness of someone who had just finished something difficult and had not yet decided how to feel about it, she held up the notepad. "He had an inside correction," she said. "Someone told him the east entrance was expected. Not the full picture, just enough to make him trust the north as genuine." Voss looked at the notepad. Then at her face. "Jalen," he said. "Not a question." "The timing fits," she said. "Cross-reference his movements against the window Vale adjusted in. 40-minute gap this afternoon where he wasn't where he was supposed to be." Voss took the notepad with the careful deliberateness of someone handling something that had just changed the weight of the evening considerably. He looked at it for a long moment. "I'll take this to him," he said. She knew he meant Ryan. She also knew, from the way he said it, quietly, with something that in anyone less composed might have read as unsettled, that what she had just handed him was not merely tactical documentation. It was the answer to a question Ryan had been asking for a long time about someone he had trusted for 11 years. The banquet hall had gone quiet. Outside the anteroom windows, the estate's perimeter lights continued their patient circuit, indifferent as ever. Neera set down her pen and sat with the specific, undecorated weight of having just dismantled something that could not be reassembled. She had become useful. She was no longer sure that was the simple thing she'd once needed it to be. And if you've made it this far, if you've watched Neera walk into the fire, outthink every dangerous person in that building, and still sit quietly with the weight of what it cost her, then you already know this isn't just a story. This is about what it means to be the person who sees clearly in a world that rewards blindness. And if that moved something in you, I need you to do one thing right now. Subscribe. Like this video. Because content like this gets buried by the algorithm unless you actively fight for it. You are the reason stories like this survive or disappear. Don't just feel something and scroll away. Be someone who acts on what moves them. Subscribe right now. And drop a comment, tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what moment hit you hardest. I read every single one. Now. Let's finish this. 3 days passed before Ryan dealt with Jalen Co. Neera wasn't present for it. She didn't ask to be, and no one offered. What she knew from the quality of the silence that followed, the particular absence that moves through a building when something that had been a long time coming has finally, irrevocably arrived. Voss said nothing about it. The remaining men said nothing about it. The estate simply continued, as estates do, with the composed indifference of a structure that has outlasted everything inside it before and fully expects to again. Corin Vale was handled with more ceremony, which she understood was the point. The syndicate required witness. It required the specific, unambiguous theater of consequence delivered publicly enough that the lesson needed no translation. She knew this the way she now knew many things about this world, not because anyone had explained it, but because she had been paying attention long enough that the grammar had become legible. She was in the East Library when Voss came to tell her it was finished. He stood in the doorway in the way he sometimes stood in doorways now, less like a guard at a post and more like a person who had quietly renegotiated the terms of his own presence. He looked at her for a moment before speaking, and she recognized the expression because she had seen a version of it before, the morning she had given him the notepad, the look of someone whose internal model has been revised and is still settling into its new configuration. "He's asking for you," Boss said. The room where Ryan received her was not the study. It was the main hall, the formal one, the one with the long table and the chandelier that cost what it cost and the assembled weight of people who moved like they owned the air they breathed. Except that tonight the assembly was not performing the rituals of polite, dangerous society. Tonight they were simply present, standing, watching, in the way that people stand and watch when something is being established rather than merely announced. Every face turned when she entered. She walked the length of the room the way she had learned to walk through difficult spaces, visible, unremarkable, present. Except that she understood, from the way the room held itself, that unremarkable was no longer available to her. That the woman who had arrived at this table as a wrongly placed guest in a borrowed seat had been quietly, permanently replaced by someone the room had already decided how to read. Ryan stood at the head of the table. He did not perform it. That was what she would remember most, that there was no theater in it, no grand gesture, no language calibrated for the audience. He simply looked at her with the same directness he had looked at her the night she'd stopped his hand, and said, in a voice that was low enough to be intimate and clear enough to reach every corner of the room, "This is Nira Solon. She sits where she chooses. She answers to no one she hasn't chosen to answer to." He paused. "Including me." The room absorbed this in the specific silence of people updating their understanding of how things work. Not surprised exactly, more the collective recognition of something that had already been true being made official. Nira stood at the head of the table beside the most dangerous man in 3 territories and felt, for the first time since a car with no markings had arrived outside her building and changed the coordinates of her life, the particular and unfamiliar steadiness of being exactly where she was supposed to be. Not a guest. Not a captive. Not a variable in someone else's equation. An anchor. The chandelier cast its light across the long white table, the crystal stemware, the assembled silence of a room that had learned, over the course of a single extraordinary fortnight, that the most consequential person in it had arrived by accident in a borrowed seat and a dress that wasn't quite right for the occasion. She had not left. She did not intend to. And neither, if you've made it here, have you. If you sat through every chapter, every silence, every moment Nira chose to stay when leaving would have been so much easier, then you owe this story something. Not money. Not anything difficult. Just 30 seconds. Subscribe. Like this video. Leave a comment that tells me where you're watching from, because I want to see exactly how far Nira's story traveled tonight. Because here is the truth, stories like this live or die based on whether people like you act, or just feel and move on. Don't be the person who felt everything in this video and did nothing. That's not who Nira would be. And I don't think it's who you are either. Subscribe. Like. Comment. And I will see you in the next story.